The morning air at Riverside Regional Airport carried the sharp scent of aviation fuel and the distant hum of propeller engines warming up on the tarmac. Heat waves already shimmered off the asphalt runway, though the sun had barely cleared the horizon. Across the flight line, a row of Cessna 172s sat in perfect formation, their white and blue paint schemes gleaming under the early light. Each aircraft bore the logo of Western States Aviation Academy, the most prestigious flight training school on the West Coast. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah Mitchell stepped out of her beaten-down Honda Civic, the driver's door creaking on hinges that had seen better days. Her flight bag, a hand-me-down from her grandfather, who had flown cargo planes in the 1970s, hung heavy on her shoulder. The leather was cracked and faded, held together in places with electrical tape, but every zipper still worked perfectly. Inside, her logbook recorded 847 hours of flight time, more than most students accumulated before graduation. She had earned every hour the hard way, paying for lessons with money scraped together from 3 part-time jobs. The flight school's main building rose before her like a monument to aviation dreams. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed the dispatch office where instructors gathered each morning, reviewing weather conditions and student schedules. Through the glass, she could see Chief Flight Instructor Robert Caldwell holding court near a large sectional chart pinned to the wall. He was pointing at something with a red pen, his voice carrying authority even through the barriers. Students clustered around him, notebooks open, hanging on every word. Sarah adjusted the strap of her flight bag and walked toward the entrance. Her flight suit was clean, but showed signs of extensive use. Small patches where fabric had worn thin, faded. Areas where the sun had bleached the navy blue material to a lighter shade. The name tape above her left breast pocket read S. Mitchell in simple block letters. No fancy embroidery, no academy insignia. Just her name. The automatic doors whispered open, releasing a burst of air conditioning that carried the familiar smell of aviation charts, coffee, and that particular scent of expensive flight training equipment. The lobby walls were lined with photographs of successful graduates, all wearing crisp airline uniforms or military flight suits. Their smiles beamed down from frames that caught the morning light filtering through the skylights above. Behind the reception desk, Jennifer Walsh looked up from her computer screen. Her expression shifted almost imperceptibly when she recognized Sarah. It wasn't hostile, exactly, but it carried the weight of uncomfortable conversations they'd had before. Jennifer's manicured fingers drummed once against the desktop before she composed herself into professional courtesy. "Sarah," she said, her voice carefully neutral, "you're here early today." "Flight review with Instructor Hayes at 8:30, Sarah replied, checking her watch. "Figured I'd review the weather and get the aircraft preflighted." Jennifer nodded toward the dispatch board mounted on the wall behind her. "Aircraft 7452G is assigned to you. Hayes is running about 10 minutes behind schedule." She paused, then added more quietly, "He mentioned you'd be discussing your application status today." Sarah's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Right, the application." The words hung in the air between them. Both women knew what that meant. This would be Sarah's 4th attempt to gain acceptance into the Academy's professional pilot program. 3 times before, she had submitted her application, complete with letters of recommendation, flight test scores that exceeded minimum requirements, and a personal statement that had taken her weeks to perfect. 3 times, the response had been the same. "While your qualifications are impressive, we feel you would benefit from additional experience before entering our accelerated program." Additional experience. The phrase had become a bitter joke. Sarah had more flight hours than half the students currently enrolled in the program. She had flown in weather conditions that would ground some licensed pilots. She had landed aircraft with failing engines, navigated through mountain passes in turbulence that rattled her teeth, and performed emergency procedures that existed only in textbooks for most pilots her age. But she wasn't wealthy. She hadn't attended expensive preparatory school. Her father wasn't a retired airline captain with connections throughout the industry. She was just Sarah Mitchell, daughter of an auto mechanic from Bakersfield, who had discovered her love of flying at 17 when her grandfather took her up in his ancient Piper Cherokee. She had saved every dollar since then, working as a waitress, a grocery store clerk, and a night shift security guard to fund her aviation dreams. In the dispatch area, Chief Instructor Caldwell's voice carried across the room as he briefed a group of first-year students. Weather this morning shows scattered clouds at 4,000 feet, visibility 10 miles, winds light and variable. Perfect conditions for pattern work. His eyes swept across the group of eager faces, all wearing matching flight suits with Academy patches prominently displayed. Remember, consistency is key. Every landing should look identical to the last one. Sarah moved past the group toward the weather station, where current conditions were displayed on multiple monitors. She studied the satellite imagery, noting a system developing to the west that wasn't expected to reach their area for another 2 days. The surface analysis showed high pressure dominating the region, promising continued clear skies. But Sarah had learned to read between the lines of weather reports. She noted the temperature dew point spread, the pressure trends, the wind patterns at different altitudes. Weather was never as simple as it appeared on paper. A burst of laughter drew her attention back to the dispatch area. Marcus Chun, one of the Academy Star students, was demonstrating something with his hands, mimicking aircraft controls while his classmates watched with admiration. Marcus came from money. His family owned a successful tech company in Silicon Valley. He had started flight training with zero experience just 8 months ago, but his progress had been meteoric. Unlike Sarah, who had to carefully budget every hour of instruction, Marcus could afford to fly daily. His flight suit was pristine, his equipment top of the line, his confidence unshakable. "That's how you handle a crosswind landing," Marcus was saying, his hands still moving through the motions. "Maintain that slip right until touchdown, then straighten her out. Piece of cake." Sarah had taught herself crosswind landings 3 years ago, practicing for hours at an uncontrolled airport where nobody charged her for pattern work. She had mastered the technique through trial and error, learning to feel the aircraft's response to every input. But she didn't interrupt Marcus's explanation. She never did. Instructor Hayes appeared at the entrance to the dispatch office, scanning the room until his eyes found Sarah. David Hayes was in his mid-50s, a former airline pilot who had joined the Academy after an early retirement. He carried himself with the measured confidence of someone who had spent 30 years in commercial aviation, flying everything from regional turboprops to wide-body jets across international routes. His interactions with Sarah had always been professional but distant, as if he was perpetually evaluating her against some standard she couldn't quite identify. "Mitchell," he called, gesturing toward the briefing room. "Let's get started." The briefing room was small and windowless, with a single table surrounded by metal chairs that had seen decades of use. Charts covered every wall, surface sectionals, approach plates, airport diagrams. A whiteboard at the front bore the faded remnants of previous lessons, ghost images of aircraft symbols and navigation fixes that had been imperfectly erased. Hayes settled into his chair and opened Sarah's training folder. The paperwork inside was thick with completed lesson plans, test scores, and evaluation forms. He flipped through several pages before finding what he was looking for. "Your flight test scores," he said, his voice neutral. "Oral exam, 94%. Practical test, 91%. Navigation exercise, 97%. Sarah waited. She had heard these numbers before. These are excellent scores, Hayes continued. Better than most students achieve on their first attempt. He closed the folder and leaned back in his chair. But the Academy has high standards for admission to the professional program. We're not just looking for technical competence. We need students who demonstrate the kind of judgment and decision-making skills that will serve them in a career cockpit. What specific areas do you think I need to improve? Sarah asked. The question came out more direct than she had intended. But she was tired of vague feedback. Hayes studied her for a moment. Your flying is solid, technically proficient. But there's something about your approach that concerns the evaluation committee. You seem to operate independently. Commercial aviation is about following procedures, working within established systems. There's no room for cowboys. Cowboys. The word hit Sarah like a physical blow. She had never been reckless, never taken unnecessary risks. If anything, her flying was conservative to a fault. She planned every flight meticulously, always carrying extra fuel, always choosing the safest routing. But apparently, her self-reliance was being interpreted as dangerous independence. I follow all procedures, she said carefully. My flight test scores reflect adherence to standard practices. In training scenarios, yes, Hayes acknowledged. But flying with an instructor is different from making decisions when you're alone in the cockpit. The committee wants to see more collaboration, more willingness to seek guidance. Sarah bit back her first response. She had been making solo decisions in aircraft cockpits since she was 19 years old. She had dealt with equipment failures, weather challenges, and emergency situations that had never appeared in any training manual. But explaining that would only reinforce their perception that she was too independent. Outside the briefing room, the sounds of the flight school coming to life filtered through the thin walls. Engines starting up, radio chatter, the steady hum of activity that marked the beginning of another training day. Sarah could hear Marcus Chun's voice among the others, confident and comfortable, already discussing his plans for an instrument training flight scheduled for that afternoon. Hayes opened her folder again and pulled out a fresh form. I'm recommending you for additional cross-country flight time, he said, beginning to write. Specifically, flights to unfamiliar airports. The committee wants to see evidence that you can adapt to different environments, work with various air traffic control facilities, handle unexpected situations. How many hours? Sarah asked, though she already suspected the answer would strain her budget to the breaking point. 25 hours minimum. And they should be complex flights, different airspace classes, varying weather conditions, challenging airports. Hayes signed the form with a flourish. This will demonstrate the kind of well-rounded experience the Academy values. 25 hours. At current rental rates, that represented nearly $3,000 Sarah didn't have. She would need to pick up extra shifts at the diner where she worked weekends, maybe find a fourth part-time job. The math was brutal, but not impossible. She had done worse calculations before. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Timeline? She asked. 3 months, Hayes replied. That should give you enough time to complete the requirement and submit a new application for the spring semester. 3 months to find the money, schedule the flights, and prove herself once again to evaluators who seemed determined to find her lacking. Sarah nodded and took the form, folding it carefully before sliding it into her flight bag. The leather folder felt heavier now, weighed down by yet another requirement, another hurdle to clear. As they left the briefing room, the dispatch area was buzzing with activity. Students clustered around the scheduling board, claiming aircraft and planning their morning flights. Sarah could see aircraft 7452G listed next to her name, a 1980 Cessna 172 with high time on the airframe and equipment that had seen better days. It wasn't the newest aircraft in the fleet, but it flew well enough for the pattern work Hayes had planned for their session. Marcus Chun passed by, heading toward the flight line with his instructor. He carried a tablet loaded with the latest navigation software, while Sarah still relied on paper charts and the handheld GPS unit her grandfather had given her. Marcus glanced in her direction and offered a polite nod, the kind of acknowledgement reserved for someone you recognized but didn't really know. Through the windows, Sarah could see the aircraft waiting on the ramp. The morning sun was climbing higher now, promising another day of perfect flying weather. In a few minutes, she would be back in her element, hands on the controls, navigating the three-dimensional world that made sense to her in ways that ground-based bureaucracy never would. But first, there was the pre-flight inspection, the careful examination of every component that would keep her airborne. Sarah had learned long ago that thorough preparation was the foundation of safe flying. She approached every flight with the same methodical attention to detail, whether it was a simple pattern session or a challenging cross-country journey. The morning was just beginning, and already Sarah could feel the familiar weight of proving herself settling onto her shoulders. It was a burden she had carried for years, one that never seemed to get lighter no matter how many hours she logged or how many tests she passed. But she shouldered it anyway, the way she had learned to shoulder everything else in her pursuit of the cockpit where she truly belonged. Aircraft 7452G waited for her on the ramp, its wings casting sharp shadows on the asphalt. Soon, she would be airborne again, where the only evaluations that mattered were the ones whispered by the wind across her control surfaces, and the only approval she needed came from the steady response of an aircraft that knew, without question, that she belonged at the controls. The student lounge at Western States Aviation Academy buzzed with the typical morning energy of ambitious pilots in training. Leather chairs arranged in clusters hosted quiet conversations about upcoming check rides, weather minimums, and job prospects at regional airlines. The walls displayed framed photographs of Academy graduates who had gone on to fly for major carriers, smiling faces in crisp uniforms standing beside Boeing 737s and Airbus A320s. Sarah pushed through the glass doors carrying a cup of coffee that had gone cold during her extended briefing with Hayes. She had hoped to find an empty corner where she could review the cross-country requirements. But the lounge was packed with first and second-year students taking advantage of the break between ground school sessions. Near the far window, a group had gathered around Marcus Chen, who was holding court with stories from his weekend flight to Lake Tahoe. His audience hung on every word as he described the challenging mountain airport approach, his hands gesturing to illustrate the steep descent angles and tricky wind patterns. The expensive flight watch on his wrist caught the light as he moved, a precision timepiece that cost more than Sarah's monthly rent. The key to mountain flying, Marcus was saying, is understanding density altitude. When you're coming into Truckee at 7,200 feet on a hot day, your aircraft performs like it's at 10,000. You have to adjust your approach speed accordingly. Sarah had flown into Truckee dozens of times, including approaches in turbulence that would have terrified most student pilots. She knew the airport's peculiarities intimately, the way afternoon thermals created violent downdrafts on the approach, and how the thin air affected engine performance during go-arounds, the critical importance of precise airspeed control in the pattern. But she remained silent, settling into a chair at the edge of the group's periphery. "Did you file IFR or VFR?" asked Jessica Hartwell, one of Marcus's classmates. Her father owned a chain of car dealerships across Northern California, and she had started flight training immediately after graduating from Stanford with a business degree. Jessica's flight training progressed at the same accelerated pace as Marcus's, funded by a family trust that treated aviation expenses like pocket change. VFR, Marcus replied. Perfect weather, unlimited visibility. Though I did get a flight following from Norcal approach for traffic advisories. He paused for effect. Actually got to share the frequency with a Southwest 737 inbound to Sacramento. Pretty cool hearing the pros work. The group murmured appreciatively. Sarah bit her tongue to avoid mentioning that she regularly monitored airline frequencies during her cross-country flights, not because it was exciting, but because it helped her understand traffic flow patterns and approach sequencing. Professional. Pilots weren't mystical figures to her. They were simply people doing a job she intended to do herself. Mountain flying is definitely on my bucket list, said Tyler Brooks, another second-year student whose trust fund had purchased him a brand-new Garmin G1000 training course. Maybe we should organize a group flight up there. Make it a learning experience. Great idea, Marcus agreed. We could reserve 3 or 4 aircraft, fly up together, spend the weekend. There's this great resort right on the lake. Sarah calculated the cost automatically: aircraft rental, fuel, overnight fees, food, lodging. For Marcus and his friends, it represented a fun weekend adventure. For her, it would consume 6 weeks of carefully saved wages from her restaurant job. She turned her attention back to the cross-country planning form Hayes had given her, trying to identify airports that would satisfy the Academy's requirements while minimizing her expenses. Sarah. The voice belonged to Amanda Pierce, one of the few students who had ever shown genuine friendliness toward her. Amanda came from a middle-class background similar to Sarah's, though her parents had managed to secure a substantial loan to fund her aviation training. She approached with a warm smile and dropped into the adjacent chair. "How did your meeting with Hayes go?" Amanda asked, keeping her voice low enough that the conversation wouldn't carry to the larger group. "Another deferral," Sarah replied quietly. "They want me to log additional cross-country time before reapplying." Amanda's expression shifted to sympathy mixed with frustration. "That's ridiculous. You have more experience than half the students already enrolled in the program." She glanced toward Marcus's group, then leaned closer. "What's their real issue?" Sarah shrugged, unwilling to voice the suspicions that had been growing in her mind. The Academy's admission criteria seemed remarkably flexible when applied to students whose families could afford full tuition payments up front. But saying that aloud would sound like sour grapes, and Sarah had learned to keep such observations to herself. "They're questioning my decision-making," she said instead. "Apparently, I'm too independent for commercial aviation." Amanda snorted derisively. "Independent? You mean competent. There's a difference." The comment drew a sharp look from Jessica Hartwell, who had been eavesdropping while pretending to study approach plates. "Did someone say competent?" she asked with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Are we talking about the student who flew that ancient Cherokee through a thunderstorm last month?" Sarah felt her cheeks flush. The incident Jessica referenced had been blown completely out of proportion. She had encountered unexpected weather during a solo cross-country flight, but she had navigated around the worst of the storm cells using onboard radar and careful route adjustments. At no point had she flown directly through dangerous weather. But the story had grown in the telling, transforming from cautious weather navigation into reckless storm penetration. "I avoided the storm," Sarah said quietly. "I diverted around it and landed at an alternate airport until conditions improved." "That's not what I heard," Jessica replied, her voice carrying just enough doubt to plant seeds of concern. "Someone mentioned you were caught in severe turbulence and had to make an emergency landing." The conversation in Marcus's group had stopped, everyone now listening to the exchange. Sarah could feel multiple sets of eyes evaluating her, measuring her response. She had been in this position before, defending decisions that had been perfectly reasonable but were being reinterpreted through the lens of prejudice and assumption. "The landing wasn't an emergency," Sarah explained patiently. "It was a precautionary diversion to wait out the weather. Standard practice for any prudent pilot." Of course, Jessica said, her tone suggesting she remained unconvinced. Unjust. Saying, maybe that's why the Academy wants to see more cross-country experience. They want to make sure students can handle challenging situations appropriately. Marcus nodded sagely. Weather decision-making is probably the most critical skill for a professional pilot. Airlines don't tolerate poor judgment when it comes to meteorology. Sarah wanted to point out that she had been making real weather decisions, while Marcus was still learning to taxi an aircraft. But arguing would only reinforce their perception that she was difficult to work with. Instead, she gathered her charts and planning materials, preparing to leave. "Where are you headed?" Amanda asked, clearly sensing the tension in the conversation. "Flight. Planning room," Sarah replied. "I need to map out these cross-country requirements." As she stood to leave, Chief Instructor Caldwell entered the lounge. His presence immediately commanded attention, conversation volume dropping as students instinctively straightened in their chairs. Caldwell was an imposing figure, a former military pilot who had transitioned to civilian instruction after retiring from the Air Force. His standards were exacting, his evaluations unforgiving, and his approval highly coveted among the student body. "Chun," Caldwell called, spotting Marcus near the window. "I need to speak with you about your instrument progress check." Marcus beamed as he approached the chief. "Instructor." The two men spoke in low tones for several minutes, Caldwell occasionally nodding and making notes in a leather portfolio. Sarah couldn't hear the conversation, but Marcus's body language suggested positive feedback. When they finished, Marcus returned to his friends with obvious satisfaction. "Good news?" Jessica asked. "Caldwell says I'm ahead of schedule," Marcus announced. "He's recommending me for early advancement to the commercial track. Apparently, my instrument skills are exceptional for someone with my level of experience." The group erupted in congratulations. Amanda caught Sarah's eye and rolled her own in sympathy. They both knew that Marcus's exceptional instrument skills had been purchased with unlimited access to aircraft and professional instruction. Sarah had developed her instrument proficiency through careful self-study and precious few hours of actual training. Yet no one seemed interested in evaluating her progress with the same enthusiasm. "That's fantastic," Tyler said. "When do you start commercial training?" "Next month, if everything goes according to plan," Marcus replied. "Caldwell thinks I could have my commercial license by Christmas." Sarah did the math. Marcus had been flying for less than a year, yet he was being fast-tracked through programs that typically required 18 months of intensive training. Meanwhile, she was being asked to prove herself yet again with additional cross-country flights that would delay her progress by another semester. The flight planning room offered blessed quiet after the social dynamics of the student lounge. Sarah spread her sectional charts across the large table and began identifying airports that would satisfy Hayes's requirements. She needed challenging destinations, airports with complex airspace, varying weather conditions, different runway configurations. But she also needed to minimize flight time and fuel costs, which meant choosing destinations within a reasonable range of her home base. She drew circles around potential airports with her pencil, calculating distances and fuel requirements. Reno Tahoe International would provide experience with airline traffic and Class C airspace. Monterey offered marine layer challenges and tricky approach conditions. Fresno featured complex controlled airspace and frequent wind patterns that would test her crosswind skills. Each destination represented hours of expensive flight time, but they would also demonstrate the breadth of experience the Academy seemed to value. A knock on the door interrupted her planning. Instructor Hayes peered into the room, scanning the charts spread across the table. "Making progress?" he asked, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. "Identifying suitable airports," Sarah replied. "I'm trying to balance the Academy's requirements with practical considerations." Hayes approached the table and studied her preliminary route planning. His finger traced the circle she had drawn, pausing at several destinations. "These look reasonable," he said after a moment, "though I'd recommend adding some airports with more challenging terrain features. Mountain flying experience would strengthen your application significantly." Sarah nodded, though she knew mountain airports would require additional training and higher rental rates for aircraft equipped with appropriate navigation equipment. Every suggestion from Hayes seemed designed to increase the financial burden of her pursuit. "There's something else we should discuss," Hayes continued, his tone becoming more serious. "The evaluation committee has expressed some concerns about your integration with the student body. They feel you might benefit from more collaborative training experiences." "Collaborative training?" Sarah asked, not sure she understood. "Group flights, shared learning experiences, peer instruction opportunities," Hayes explained. "The Academy values students who work well with others, who can contribute to a team environment. Commercial aviation is fundamentally about crew coordination." Sarah stared at him. She had never been invited to participate in group flights or collaborative training. The informal study groups and weekend flying adventures were organized by students who could afford such luxuries. She was excluded not by choice, but by economic necessity. "I'm willing to participate in group activities," she said carefully, "but I've never been included in those opportunities." Hayes frowned, as if this was the first time he had considered the possibility. "I see. Well, perhaps we can arrange some structured group exercises. The Academy wants to see evidence that you can work effectively with your peers." After Hayes left, Sarah returned to her charts with a growing sense of frustration. Every requirement seemed designed to evaluate qualities that had nothing to do with flying ability. She could navigate through complex airspace, land aircraft in challenging conditions, and make critical decisions under pressure. But apparently, those skills mattered less than her ability to afford weekend trips to mountain resorts. The planning room fell silent except for the whisper of pencil on paper as Sarah continued mapping her required cross-country flights. Outside the windows, she could hear aircraft engines starting up as the afternoon flying schedule commenced. Soon, she would be back in the cockpit where her competence spoke for itself, where the only judgment that mattered came from the physics of flight rather than the prejudices of human evaluators. But first, she had to find a way to pay for 25 hours of additional flight time while maintaining the part-time jobs that kept her financially afloat. The math was daunting, the timeline aggressive, and the outcome far from guaranteed. Yet she had faced similar challenges before and found ways to overcome them. Sarah folded her charts with practiced efficiency and headed toward the dispatch office to schedule her first cross-country flight. Whatever the Academy's true motivations, she would meet their requirements and prove her worthiness once again. She had come too far to quit now, regardless of how many hoops they asked her to jump through. The county airport, 20 miles east of Riverside Regional, sat forgotten between agricultural fields and industrial warehouses. Modesto Municipal had seen better days. Its single runway showed patches of recent repair work, and the lone hangar bore rust stains from decades of Central Valley weather. But what it lacked in prestige, it made up for in affordable aircraft rental rates and an absence of judgmental flight instructors. Sarah's alarm buzzed at 4:30 in the morning, piercing the darkness of her studio apartment. She had learned to maximize her flying budget by booking aircraft during off-peak hours when rental rates dropped by 30%. Dawn flights also offered the smoothest air conditions before thermal activity made practice approaches challenging for inexperienced pilots. She dressed quickly in the pre-flight routine she had perfected over months of early morning departures. The drive to Modesto took 45 minutes through empty highways and sleeping farm towns. Sarah used the time to mentally rehearse the day's training objectives. She had designed her own curriculum to address the deficiencies Hayes had identified in her academy application. Today's focus would be precision approaches using only basic instrumentation, the kind of skills that separated truly competent pilots from those who relied exclusively on modern avionics. Hangar 3 housed Pacific Flight Services, a bare-bones operation run by retired airline captain Frank Novak. The business existed primarily to provide affordable instruction to pilots who couldn't afford academy prices. Frank's aircraft were older and less sophisticated than academy trainers, but they were maintained to rigorous standards and equipped with the fundamental instruments every pilot needed to master. Sarah found Frank performing a pre-flight inspection on N8394X, a 1975 Cessna 172 that had accumulated over 12,000 hours of flight time. The paint was faded and the interior showed decades of use, but the engine ran smoothly and every instrument functioned reliably. Frank had purchased the aircraft from a flight school bankruptcy auction and restored it to airworthy condition. Through months of meticulous work. "Early bird today," Frank observed, signing off the aircraft logbook with practiced efficiency. "What's the mission?" "Instrument approaches," Sarah replied, conducting her own visual inspection of the aircraft exterior. "I want to practice the ILS at Stockton, then work on VOR approaches at Modesto before the winds pick up." Frank nodded approvingly. His philosophy emphasized fundamental skills over flashy technology. While academy students learned to fly using integrated glass cockpits and GPS navigation systems, Frank's students mastered traditional instruments and basic radio navigation. The skills were transferable, and more importantly, they built genuine understanding of aircraft systems rather than button-pushing proficiency. "Weather's looking good for the next few hours," Frank said, handing her the aircraft keys. "Marine layer should burn off by 8 o'clock, giving you an unlimited ceiling for approach work." Sarah accepted the keys and completed her pre-flight inspection with methodical thoroughness. She checked fuel quantity and quality, examined control surfaces for damage or excessive wear, tested flight controls for proper response, and verified that all required documents were current and properly filed. The ritual grounded her, providing familiar structure before challenging herself with demanding training objectives. The ancient Cessna's cockpit felt like home after hundreds of hours spent in its cramped confines. Sarah adjusted her seat position and harnessed tension, then began the engine start procedure from memory. The Continental 0320 engine caught on the second blade, settling into the steady rhythm that had carried countless pilots through their training. She allowed the engine to warm while reviewing approach plates for Stockton Metropolitan Airport. Radio calls at uncontrolled airports required different techniques than academy training emphasized. Without ground control or clearance delivery, pilots coordinated their movements through careful monitoring of common traffic advisory frequencies. Sarah announced her taxi intentions and listened for other aircraft in the pattern before proceeding to the runway. The self-reliance required at smaller airports had taught her situational awareness skills that academy students rarely developed. Takeoff clearance came from her own judgment rather than air traffic control authorization. Sarah verified that the approach path was clear, checked for conflicting traffic, and rolled onto the runway when conditions were appropriate. The Cessna lifted off smoothly, climbing into morning air that was still cool and stable. She established cruise flight towards Stockton. While reviewing the complexities of instrument approach procedures, Stockton's ILS approach provided excellent training for precision flying techniques. The instrument landing system used radio beams to guide aircraft along exact flight paths to the runway, requiring pilots to maintain precise heading, altitude, and airspeed throughout the descent. Deviations of more than a few degrees or 100 feet could result in approach failure or worse, collision with terrain or obstacles. Sarah contacted Stockton Tower 15 miles from the airport and requested the ILS runway 29 approach. The Controller issued vectors to the initial approach fix, directing her through a series of heading changes that positioned the aircraft for interception of the localizer beam. She configured the aircraft for approach speed, lowering flaps and reducing power to maintain stable descent rates. Cessna 8394X, turn left heading 270, maintain 3000 until established on the localizer. Cleared ILS runway 29 approach. The controller transmitted. Sarah acknowledged the clearance and turned toward the final approach course. The localizer needle on her navigation display centered as she intercepted the beam, indicating proper alignment with the runway centerline. She began descent as the glide slope needle moved toward center position, maintaining exactly 90 knots of indicated airspeed while following the electronic path toward the runway. Instrument approaches demanded complete trust in aircraft instruments over visual cues. Even in clear weather conditions, pilots practiced partial panel techniques using minimal instrumentation to simulate equipment failures. Sarah had spent countless hours developing the skills to fly precise approaches using only basic instruments, building proficiency that would serve her throughout her aviation career. The approach progressed flawlessly until she reached decision height, the minimum altitude where pilots must transition from instrument to visual flight for landing. Sarah executed a missed approach as planned, climbing away from the runway to practice the entire procedure again. Repetition built muscle memory and confidence that would prove invaluable during actual instrument conditions. After completing 3 successful approaches at Stockton, Sarah departed for Modesto to practice VOR navigation techniques. Very high-frequency omnidirectional range stations provided the backbone of aviation navigation before GPS systems became standard equipment. Master pilots could navigate across entire continents using VOR radials and distance measuring equipment, skills that remained relevant for aircraft operating without modern avionics. The VOR approach at Modesto required different techniques than precision instrument approaches. VOR signals provided course guidance, but no glide slope information, forcing pilots to calculate descent rates and timing points independently. Sarah established the aircraft on the appropriate radial and began descent at calculated intervals, monitoring her progress using stopwatch timing and dead reckoning navigation. Frank had taught her to treat every VOR approach as a test of fundamental piloting skills. Without electronic glide slope guidance, pilots relied on mathematical calculations, precise timing, and thorough knowledge of aircraft performance characteristics. The techniques were more demanding than modern GPS approaches, but they built a deeper understanding of navigation principles. Sarah completed 4 VOR approaches with textbook precision, maintaining course center lines within acceptable tolerances and arriving at minimum descent altitudes at exactly the calculated timing points. Her logbook would record the approaches as instrument training time, valuable experience that demonstrated proficiency with traditional navigation equipment. Between approaches, she practiced unusual attitude recovery techniques that Academy students rarely encountered. Frank had installed a view-limiting device that simulated instrument meteorological conditions, forcing Sarah to rely entirely on flight instruments during recovery procedures. She intentionally placed the aircraft in steep turns, unusual climb attitudes, and simulated spiral dives, then recovered using only instrument references. The training was demanding and occasionally uncomfortable, but it built confidence in her ability to handle emergency situations without instructor assistance. Academy students learned similar procedures in controlled classroom environments, but Frank's training emphasized real-world application under actual stress conditions. The difference in skill development was measurable and significant. As morning progressed into afternoon, thermal activity began affecting aircraft performance. Rising columns of heated air created turbulence that made precision flying more challenging. Sarah used the conditions as additional training opportunities, practicing approaches in bumpy air that required constant control inputs to maintain stable flight paths. Her final exercise involved simulated, emergency approaches with various equipment. Failures. Frank had taught her to fly approaches using only partial instrument panels, simulating failures of critical flight instruments. Sarah practiced approaches with covered attitude indicators, failed heading instruments, and simulated electrical system failures that eliminated most electronic navigation equipment. The emergency procedures required creative problem-solving and thorough knowledge of backup systems. Sarah navigated approaches using magnetic compass headings, calculated timing points using clock and airspeed information, and maintained aircraft control through fundamental stick and rudder techniques. The skills were rarely tested in academy training, but they formed the foundation of truly competent IRMAN SHIP. By noon, Sarah had logged 4 hours of intensive training time that would have cost nearly $800 at academy rates. Frank's instruction fees were minimal, focused more on sharing knowledge than generating profit. He had recognized Sarah's dedication and natural ability early in their relationship, providing guidance that academy instructors seemed reluctant to offer. How did it feel today? Frank asked as they secured the aircraft in its hangar space. Solid, Sarah replied, updating her logbook with the day's training accomplishments. The VOR approaches felt natural, and I'm comfortable with partial panel techniques now. Frank nodded with satisfaction. You're developing the kind of skills that will serve you well in any cockpit. Don't let anyone tell you that fancy equipment makes better pilots. Fundamental proficiency is what matters when things go wrong. His words carried weight earned through decades of professional flying experience. Frank had flown everything from military fighters to international cargo aircraft, accumulating over 20,000 hours of flight time across every conceivable condition and emergency situation. His evaluation of Sarah's abilities was based on practical experience rather than academic theory. Have you given any thought to alternative paths? Frank asked as they walked toward the parking area. There are other ways to build flying careers besides academy programs. Sarah had considered the alternatives: regional airlines that hired pilots with minimal experience, cargo companies that valued practical skills over prestigious credentials, charter operations that prioritized competence over connections. But her goal remained the major airlines, and academy graduation remained the most direct path toward that objective. I want to try the academy route one more time, she said. If that doesn't work out, I'll consider other options. Frank understood her determination. He had seen talented pilots succeed through various career paths, some more traditional than others. The aviation industry was slowly recognizing that competence could develop outside established training pipelines, though change was gradual and often resisted by institutional preferences. The drive back to Riverside gave Sarah time to process the morning's training accomplishments. She had demonstrated proficiency in advanced procedures that many academy graduates never mastered. Her instrument skills were sharp, her navigation techniques precise, and her emergency preparedness thorough. Yet she remained excluded from the VA Academy program that would provide the fastest path to her career. Objectives. Evening brought the familiar routine of her restaurant shift, serving dinner to customers who had no idea that their waitress could navigate aircraft through complex airspace with precision that exceeded many professional pilots' abilities. Sarah had learned to compartmentalize the different aspects of her life, maintaining focus on immediate responsibilities while pursuing long-term aviation goals. Between taking orders and delivering meals, she mentally reviewed the cross-country flights Hayes had assigned. The additional training requirements would consume most of her savings and require careful scheduling around work obligations. But she had faced similar challenges before and found ways to overcome them through determination and creative resource management. Her logbook now contained nearly 900 hours of flight time, accumulated through systematic effort and financial Sacrifice. Every entry represented progress toward her ultimate goal, even when that progress seemed invisible to Academy evaluators. She had developed skills and experience that would serve her throughout her aviation career, regardless of how long the path to professional flying might take. The evening shift ended near midnight, leaving Sarah tired but satisfied with another day's progress toward her objectives. Tomorrow would bring more challenges and more opportunities to demonstrate her capabilities. She had learned patience through years of systematic preparation, understanding that eventual success required persistent effort rather than dramatic breakthroughs. Her apartment welcomed her with familiar silence and the promise of a few hours' rest before the next day's responsibilities. Sarah hung her uniform in the closet beside her flight suits, physical reminders of the different worlds she navigated daily. Both required dedication and competence, though only one offered the possibility of achieving her dreams. She fell asleep reviewing approach procedures in her mind, preparing for the next morning's training flight and the ongoing pursuit of skills that would eventually carry her beyond the limitations others seemed determined to impose. The Weather Service forecast had been wrong before, but never this dramatically. What should have been a routine Tuesday morning at Western States Aviation Academy transformed into something that made even veteran instructors pause at their coffee cups and study. The satellite imagery with furrowed brows, the marine layer that typically burned off by 9 o'clock had thickened overnight, rolling inland like a gray avalanche that swallowed airports across 3 counties. Sarah arrived at the academy to find the dispatch office buzzing with frustrated energy. Flight schedules that had been carefully coordinated the night before were dissolving into chaos as visibility dropped below legal minimums at airports throughout the region. Students clustered around weather monitors, watching real-time conditions deteriorate in ways their textbooks had described, but few had actually witnessed. Stockton's reporting 1/4 mile visibility, announced Chief Instructor Caldwell, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to making difficult decisions. Modesto just went below minimums 10 minutes ago. We're looking at widespread IFR conditions for the next 6 hours minimum. Marcus Chun stood near the front of the group, his expensive flight bag slung over his shoulder in preparation for a cross-country flight that would now be impossible. His expression showed the particular frustration of someone whose carefully planned schedule had been disrupted by forces beyond his control. The Garmin G100 training course he had booked for the afternoon would have to be rescheduled, along with the mountain flying expedition his father had arranged for the weekend. What about alternative airports? Asked Jessica Hartwell, scrolling through weather reports on her tablet. Maybe we could repositioning aircraft to airports that are still VFR? Caldwell shook his head grimly. The marine layer extends from San Francisco to Fresno. Everything west of the Central Valley is socked in. Even if we could get aircraft out, we'd have nowhere to bring them back. The cancellation of scheduled flights meant different things to different students. For Marcus and his well-funded classmates, it represented a minor inconvenience, postponed lessons that could easily be rescheduled without financial consequences. Their training accounts carried sufficient balances to absorb unexpected delays and additional fees. But for students operating on tight budgets, canceled flights meant lost deposits, rescheduling charges, and potentially missing critical training milestones. Sarah studied the weather patterns with professional interest rather than frustration. The marine layer's behavior fascinated her, the way it moved inland through specific geographic channels, how temperature inversions trapped moisture at precise altitudes, the meteorological conditions that would eventually cause its dissipation. She had flown in similar conditions before, navigating through instrument approaches when visibility was measured in hundreds of feet rather than miles. Mitchell. Instructor Hayes appeared at her shoulder, his voice carrying an undertone she couldn't immediately identify. I need to speak with you privately. They retreated to the same briefing room where Sarah had received her latest set of requirements just weeks earlier. Hayes closed the door and activated the white noise generator that ensured confidential conversations remained private. His demeanor suggested serious business rather than routine training discussions. "I received an interesting phone call yesterday," Hayes began, settling into his chair with deliberate movements, "from Frank Novak at Pacific Flight Services." Sarah felt her stomach tighten. She had assumed her training activities at Modesto would remain separate from academy business. Frank had always emphasized discretion regarding his students' other training commitments, understanding the competitive pressures within the aviation education industry. "Frank called to verify some information about your training background," Hayes continued. "Apparently, there's been some discussion about your instrument proficiency. He wanted to make sure we were aware of your supplemental activities." The words carried implications that Sarah didn't like. Supplemental activities sounded like violations of academy policy rather than legitimate additional training. She had never signed any agreements restricting her right to pursue flight instruction elsewhere, but academy politics often operated according to unwritten rules and unofficial expectations. "I've been practicing instrument approaches during my own time," Sarah said carefully. "Using my own funds in aircraft not affiliated with the academy." Hayes nodded slowly. "Frank mentioned that you've been conducting some fairly advanced training. Partial panel work, unusual attitude recovery, non-precision approaches in actual instrument conditions." He paused, consulting notes written on academy letterhead. "He seemed quite impressed with your proficiency levels." Sarah waited for the other shoe to drop. Praise from Hayes always came with qualifications or concerns that undermined whatever positive feedback he might offer. The pattern had become so predictable that she automatically braced herself for criticism disguised as constructive guidance. "The evaluation committee has some concerns about students pursuing training outside our supervised curriculum," Hayes continued. "There are questions about quality control, standardization, and insurance liability. The Academy has invested considerable resources in developing comprehensive training programs, and we prefer that students focus their efforts within our structured environment." Translation: "Stop training elsewhere because it makes our program look inadequate." Sarah had suspected this conversation was inevitable once her skills began exceeding those of students who trained exclusively within academy walls. Her instrument proficiency had reached levels that took academy students months longer to achieve, despite having access to more sophisticated equipment and unlimited funding. "I understand the academy's position," Sarah replied diplomatically, "but I'm trying to build the experience base your evaluation committee requested. Frank's instruction has been invaluable for developing skills that will strengthen my application." Hayes leaned back in his chair, studying her with an expression that suggested internal calculations were taking place. "There's another issue we need to discuss. Your financial situation has come to the committee's attention." Now they were approaching the real issue. Sarah had always known that her economic status made academy administrators uncomfortable. Students who couldn't afford full tuition payments represented potential complications: incomplete training programs, defaulted loans, public relations problems if they struggled with financial obligations. "My account is current," Sarah said. "I've never missed a payment or defaulted on any obligations." "That's not the concern," Hayes replied. "The committee questions whether students under financial stress can maintain the focus necessary for professional aviation training. There are concerns about divided attention, the need to work multiple jobs, the possibility that economic pressures might compromise decision-making in critical situations." Sarah stared at him in disbelief. Her financial constraints had made her more focused, not less. Every flight hour represented significant sacrifice and careful planning. She approached training with intensity that wealthy students rarely demonstrated because they understood the true cost of wasted opportunities. "My financial situation has never compromised my training performance," she said. struggling to keep her voice level. If anything, it's made me more committed to maximizing every learning opportunity. Perhaps, Hayes acknowledged. But the Academy operates according to certain standards and expectations. We need students who can fully commit to our program without external distractions or competing priorities. The conversation was heading in a direction that made Sarah increasingly uncomfortable. Academy standards seemed remarkably flexible when applied to wealthy students whose families made substantial donations or maintained influential connections. But students like her faced scrutiny that had nothing to do with flying ability or professional potential. What exactly is the Academy asking of me? Sarah asked directly. Hayes consulted his notes again before responding. The committee would prefer that you suspend outside training activities and focus exclusively on Academy programs. They're also requesting additional documentation regarding your financial stability and long-term career planning. Additional documentation. More hoops to jump through, more requirements designed to create barriers rather than evaluate competence. Sarah had submitted financial information multiple times already, demonstrating her ability to meet tuition obligations despite limited resources. But apparently, her economic status remained a perpetual source of concern for evaluators who had never worked multiple jobs to fund their own training. I'll need time to consider these requests, Sarah said carefully. Of course, Hayes replied. But I should mention that the committee is meeting next week to review current applications. Any additional documentation should be submitted before then. As they concluded the meeting, Sarah felt the familiar weight of institutional pressure settling on her shoulders. Every interaction with Academy administration seemed designed to remind her that she was an outsider seeking admission to an exclusive club. Her competence was constantly questioned, her motivations scrutinized, her very presence treated as a potential problem requiring management. Outside the briefing room, the weather situation had continued deteriorating. Visibility reports from airports throughout the region showed conditions dropping toward minimums that would challenge even experienced instrument pilots. The marine layer had evolved into a meteorological event that would be discussed in classrooms for years to come, a perfect example of how Pacific weather systems could create dangerous flying conditions with minimal advance warning. Students filled the time by reviewing ground school materials and conducting equipment familiarization exercises. Marcus and his study group occupied the main conference room, working through commercial pilot test preparation materials with the kind of focused intensity that came from knowing their careers depended on academic performance. They had spread charts and reference materials across the large table, creating an organized study environment that looked like a professional flight planning session. Sarah found herself excluded from the group, as usual. The unofficial study sessions were organized through social networks she didn't belong to, coordinated via text messages and informal conversations that happened outside her presence. She had long ago stopped expecting invitations to collaborative learning opportunities that seemed reserved for students whose backgrounds matched Academy expectations. Instead, she claimed a small table near the window and opened her own study materials. The Federal Aviation Regulations Manual was dog-eared from constant use, filled with handwritten notes and highlighted passages that marked important concepts. Unlike students who could afford multiple reference books and online training courses, Sarah had learned to extract maximum value from basic study materials through repeated review and practical application. The weather outside continued its relentless deterioration. What had started as a typical marine layer incursion was evolving into something more significant, a weather system that would test the preparedness and decision-making abilities of pilots throughout the region. Sarah watched visibility decrease in real time, observing meteorological principles she had studied in textbooks playing out in dramatic fashion just beyond the Academy windows. "Crazy weather," Amanda Pierce commented, approaching Sarah's table with her own study materials. I've never seen a marine layer this thick or persistent. It's a classic temperature inversion scenario, Sarah replied, pointing toward the weather display. The marine layer is trapped between a high-pressure system and warmer air aloft. Until that thermal structure changes, the fog isn't going anywhere. Amanda nodded, though her expression suggested the meteorological explanation was more complex than her ground school training had covered. Think we'll get any flying done today? Not unless conditions improve dramatically, Sarah answered. Current visibility is well below VFR minimums, and the forecast doesn't show improvement until late afternoon. As they spoke, the emergency frequency crackled to life over the Academy's monitoring speakers. A pilot somewhere in the region was declaring an emergency, requesting immediate assistance with an instrument approach to the nearest available airport. The transmission was broken and difficult to understand, but the urgency in the pilot's voice was unmistakable. Conversation in the dispatch office stopped as everyone focused on the emergency communications. Air traffic control was vectoring the aircraft toward an approach at Sacramento International, one of the few airports in the region still operating under instrument flight rules. The pilot sounded stressed but professional, working through emergency procedures while navigating in conditions that had challenged even experienced aviators. Poor visibility, engine running rough, requesting priority handling for immediate approach. The pilot transmitted. Sarah found herself mentally flying the approach alongside the emergency aircraft, visualizing the instrument procedures required to navigate safely through the marine layer to a successful landing. She had practiced similar scenarios countless times with Frank, building proficiency in exactly the kind of challenging conditions that were currently grounding most of the Academy's training fleet. The emergency aircraft eventually landed safely at Sacramento, but the incident served as a stark reminder of how quickly routine flights could become life-threatening situations. Weather conditions that looked manageable on paper could deteriorate into challenges that tested every aspect of pilot training and experience. As the morning progressed, it became clear that the weather would not improve enough to allow normal training operations. Academy administrators began making contingency plans for rescheduling canceled flights and accommodating students whose training timelines would be affected by the extended weather delay. For Sarah, the forced downtime represented both lost opportunity and unwelcome scrutiny. Every canceled flight meant delayed progress toward her training requirements, while the Academy's questions about her outside activities created additional pressure to conform to expectations that seemed designed to exclude her. She gathered her study materials and prepared to leave, knowing that the evening would be spent working her restaurant shift while processing the implications of her conversation with Hayes. The Academy's demands for exclusivity would force difficult decisions about her training priorities and financial strategies. But as she walked toward the parking lot, Sarah couldn't help noticing that the weather conditions grounding the Academy's modern fleet were exactly the kind of challenges she had been preparing for through her supplemental training with Frank, while other students waited for clear skies and perfect visibility. She had been developing the skills to fly safely in conditions that would test every aspect of her instrument proficiency. The irony was not lost on her. The Academy questioned her decision-making and preparedness, yet she was among the few students who had actually trained for the demanding conditions currently affecting the entire region. Her supplemental activities weren't distractions from professional preparation. They were exactly the kind of real-world training that separated competent pilots from those who could only fly in perfect weather. The emergency alert pierced through the afternoon quiet at Western States Aviation Academy like a blade through silk. 3 sharp tones echoed from speakers throughout the building, followed by the voice of Sacramento Approach Control broadcasting on the emergency frequency. All stations, this is the Sacramento approach. We have a medical emergency inbound from the north. Aircraft is a Beechcraft King Air with 2 souls on board. including one critical patient requiring immediate transport to UC Davis Medical Center. Pilot reports complete electrical failure and zero visibility in heavy marine layer. All airports in the region are below minimums. Requesting any available assistance for emergency approach guidance. The dispatch office erupted into controlled chaos. Chief Instructor Caldwell immediately began coordinating with air traffic control while several instructors pulled sectional charts to identify possible alternate airports. Students gathered around radio equipment, listening to communications that represented every pilot's worst nightmare, a life-or-death emergency unfolding in weather conditions that had already grounded nearly every aircraft in Northern California. Sarah pushed through the crowd surrounding the emergency frequency monitor. The situation was developing rapidly, with new information coming every few minutes as controllers tried to establish reliable communication with the distressed aircraft. The pilot's voice carried the strain of someone fighting both equipment failures and deteriorating weather while carrying responsibility for a critically injured passenger. Sacramento approach, King Air November 74 Delta Mike. We've lost all navigation equipment. Transponder is dead and I'm showing less than quarter-mile visibility. Patient is unconscious. We need to get on the ground immediately. Request vectors to any airport with approach capabilities. The controller's response was professional, but carried an undertone of growing concern. King Air November 74 Delta Mike. Sacramento approach. We're showing widespread IFR conditions throughout the region. San Francisco, Oakland, San Jose, Stockton, and Modesto are all reporting visibility below minimums. Fresno is a marginal VFR, but that's over 60 miles southeast of your position. Sarah knew the geography intimately. Fresno would require the King Air to navigate through some of the most challenging airspace in California, threading between mountain ranges while flying on nothing but basic compass headings and altitude references. With no functioning navigation, equipment, and a critical patient on board, that route represented an almost impossible challenge. Is there anyone here certified for emergency approach guidance? Caldwell called out to the assembled instructors and students. The question hung in the air as Academy personnel exchanged uncertain glances. Emergency approach guidance required specialized training in radar vectoring procedures and non-precision approach techniques. Most civilian flight instructors had theoretical knowledge of the procedures, but actual experience directing aircraft through instrument approaches without functioning navigation equipment was extremely rare. Instructor Hayes stepped forward. I have some experience with search and rescue coordination, but I've never actually talked an aircraft down through a full instrument approach. Same here, admitted another instructor. We covered the procedures in ground school, but it's not something civilian pilots typically encounter. The radio crackled again with increasing desperation in the pilot's voice. Sacramento approach, King Air 74 Delta Mike. Patient is showing signs of respiratory distress. We need to get on the ground in the next 15 minutes or we're going to lose him. Can you vector us toward any airport with emergency medical facilities? Sarah felt her pulse quicken as she processed the developing situation. The King Air pilot was dealing with multiple simultaneous emergencies: medical, mechanical, and meteorological. Without functioning navigation equipment, he was essentially flying blind through a marine layer that had reduced visibility to near zero throughout the region. The patient's deteriorating condition meant there was no time to fly to distant airports with better weather conditions. What about UC Davis Medical Center's helipad? Suggested Marcus Chun. They have trauma facilities and could handle the medical emergency immediately. Caldwell shook his head grimly. Hospital helipads aren't equipped for fixed-wing aircraft, especially not turboprops in emergency situations. We need a real airport with instrument approach capabilities and emergency equipment. The controller's voice returned with updated weather information that made the situation even more critical. King Air 74 Delta Mike. Be advised that Stockton Metropolitan is reporting 1/8 mile visibility in fog, well below published minimums for any instrument approach. We don't have any airports within your fuel range that are currently above minimums. Sarah stepped forward before she could second-guess herself. I know Stockton's approaches, she said quietly. The room fell silent except for the continued radio chatter from the emergency. All eyes turned towards Sarah, expressions ranging from surprise to skepticism. Her statement seemed presumptuous, coming from a student who had been repeatedly denied admission to the Academy's professional program. What did you say? Caldwell asked, his voice carrying both curiosity and doubt. I've flown Stockton's approaches dozens of times, Sarah repeated. More clearly this time. Both ILS and VOR procedures, in actual instrument conditions. I know the airport layout, the obstacle clearances, and the emergency procedures. Hayes frowned disapprovingly. Mitchell, this isn't the time for academic discussion. We're dealing with a real emergency situation. That's exactly why I'm speaking up, Sarah replied, maintaining steady eye contact with Caldwell. I've practiced partial panel approaches at Stockton using basic instruments. If the King Air pilot has a compass, altimeter, and airspeed indicator, I can talk him through an approach. The emergency radio interrupted their conversation with increasingly urgent communications. Sacramento approach, King Air 74 Delta Mike. Patient is critical. We're declaring a pan-pan medical emergency. Request immediate vectors to the nearest airport, regardless of weather conditions. Caldwell studied Sarah with an intensity she had never seen before. You're saying you could provide approach guidance to an aircraft with failed electrical systems? Yes, Sarah answered without hesitation. I've trained extensively in partial panel procedures and non-precision approaches. The key is understanding how to use basic flight instruments and timing to navigate the approach without electronic guidance. This is completely inappropriate, Hayes interjected. Mitchell is not a certified controller or emergency coordinator. She's a student pilot with no authority to. She's also the only person in this room who might be able to save 2 lives. Amanda Pierce interrupted, her voice cutting through the objections. If Sarah says she can do it, maybe we should listen. The controller's voice carried increasing urgency as the situation continued deteriorating. King Air 74 Delta Mike, we're running out of options. Fuel state and patient condition require immediate landing. Can you attempt an approach to Stockton Metropolitan despite being below minimums? Sarah turned to Caldwell with determination. That surprised even herself. Let me try to help them. The worst-case scenario is that I fail and they have to try something else. But if I can guide them down safely, we will save 2 lives. Caldwell hesitated for several seconds that felt like hours. The weight of decision hung in the air as radio chatter continued detailing the emergency aircraft's deteriorating situation. Finally, he reached for the radio microphone connected to the Academy's emergency frequency. Sacramento approach, this is Western States Aviation Academy Chief Instructor Caldwell. We have a student here with extensive experience in partial panel approaches at Stockton. Request permission to assist with emergency approach guidance. The controller's response was immediate and relieved. Western States Aviation, Sacramento approach. Any assistance would be greatly appreciated. We're transferring King Air 74 Delta Mike to your frequency for direct communication. Sarah took the microphone with hands that were steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. This was the moment that would either vindicate years of intensive training or expose her to criticism that could end her aviation aspirations permanently. But the choice was clear: 2 lives hung in the balance, and she possessed skills that might make the difference between survival and tragedy. King Air November 74 Delta Mike, this is Western States Emergency Assistance. I'm going to help you with an approach to Stockton Metropolitan Airport. What is your current position, and what instruments do you have available? The pilot's voice carried gratitude mixed with desperation. Western States, King Air 74 Delta Mike. We're approximately 20 miles north of Stockton, altitude 4,000 feet. We have basic flight instruments: compass, altimeter, airspeed, and turn coordinator. Everything else is dead. Patient is unconscious and showing irregular breathing. Sarah closed her eyes briefly, visualizing Stockton's airport layout and approach procedures from memory. She had flown these approaches so many times that she could navigate them mentally, understanding every obstacle and terrain feature that would affect the aircraft's path to the runway. King Air 74 Delta Mike, copy your situation. I'm going to guide you through a VOR approach to runway 29 left at Stockton. This will require precise heading and timing control, but we can get you on the ground safely. Are you ready to copy approach instructions? The Academy dispatch office had become completely silent except for Sarah's voice and the emergency aircraft's responses. Every instructor and student listened intently as she began providing detailed guidance to the distressed pilot. Her instructions were clear, confident, and delivered with authority that surprised everyone who had questioned her competence. First, I need you to turn to heading 180 and begin descent to 3,000 feet. Sarah continued. Maintain exactly 100 knots indicated airspeed. This heading will take you to the initial approach fix for the VOR runway 29 left approach. The pilot acknowledged her instructions and reported beginning the turn and descent. Sarah monitored his progress by coordinating with Sacramento Approach Control, who was tracking the aircraft on radar despite its failed transponder. The King Air was following her guidance precisely, demonstrating the kind of disciplined flying that would be essential for completing a successful approach. Western States, King Air 74 Delta Mike. We're established on heading 180, descending through 3,500 feet. Patient is still unconscious, but breathing appears to be stabilizing slightly. Sarah felt a surge of hope, mixed with continued concentration. The approach was progressing according to plan, but the most challenging phases were still ahead. Guiding an aircraft through the final approach course without electronic navigation would require perfect timing and precise control inputs. King Air 74 Delta Mike, excellent work. Continue descent to 3,000 feet and report when level. In approximately 3 minutes, I'll have you turn inbound to begin the final approach course. Around her, the Academy personnel watched in amazement as Sarah demonstrated expertise that exceeded what most of them had expected from any student, let alone one who had been repeatedly denied admission to their professional program. Her knowledge of approach procedures was encyclopedic, her communication skills were professional, and her confidence under pressure was unshakable. Hayes stood speechless near the back of the group, his previous criticisms of Sarah's independence and decision-making seeming hollow in the face of her current performance. Marcus Chun and his study group had abandoned their commercial pilot materials to listen to real emergency procedures being executed with textbook precision. The radio crackled with the King Air pilot's next transmission. Western States, 74 Delta Mike. Level at 3,000 feet. Patient appears to be regaining consciousness. Your guidance is keeping us alive up here. Sarah smiled grimly and keyed the microphone again. King Air 74 Delta Mike, glad to hear about your patient's improvement. Now we're going to begin the most critical phase of the approach. Turn left to heading 090 and start your timer. We'll be flying this approach using precise timing and altitude control. The most dangerous part of the emergency was just beginning, but Sarah felt completely in her element. This was what all her training with Frank had prepared her for, the moment when theoretical knowledge became life-saving action, when competence under pressure mattered more than institutional approval or financial status. The Academy's evaluation committee would have plenty to discuss after this day was over. But first, Sarah had to guide 2 people safely through conditions that had challenged every other pilot in the region. The next few minutes would determine whether her years of preparation had been sufficient for the ultimate test of aviation skill and judgment. King Air 74 Delta Mike, you should be crossing the outer marker now. Begin descent to 2,400 feet and reduce speed to 90 knots. Start your final approach timer. We have 4 minutes and 20 seconds to the runway. Sarah's voice remained steady despite the intensity building in the Academy's dispatch office. Every person in the room understood they were witnessing something extraordinary. A student pilot, with no official authority, successfully guiding a disabled aircraft through one of the most challenging instrument approaches in aviation. The King Air was flying blind through weather that had grounded experienced pilots throughout the region, relying entirely on Sarah's expertise to find the runway. Western States, 74 Delta Mike descending to 2,400. Speed coming back to 90 knots. Timer started. Patient is conscious now and asking questions. That's a good sign. The pilot's voice carried cautious optimism for the first time since declaring the emergency. Chief Instructor Caldwell stood behind Sarah, monitoring her progress through coordination with Sacramento Approach Control. The radar controller was providing position updates that confirmed the King Air was tracking perfectly along the approach course. Sarah's guidance was proving flawlessly accurate, despite using only basic timing and compass heading instructions. Descent rate should be approximately 500 feet per minute, Sarah continued. At 2 minutes into the approach, you should be passing through 1,800 feet. Call out your altitude when you reach that point. The dispatch office had become mission control for an operation that would normally require extensive coordination between air traffic control facilities, emergency services, and specially trained personnel. Instead, a student who had been denied academy admission was orchestrating the entire emergency response with competence that left seasoned instructors speechless. Marcus Chun watched from the back of the room, his expression shifting from skepticism to amazement as Sarah demonstrated knowledge that exceeded anything he had encountered in formal coursework. Her understanding of instrument approach procedures was encyclopedic, her communication skills were professional, and her ability to remain calm under life-threatening pressure was remarkable. "This is incredible," Amanda Pierce whispered to Tyler. "Brooks, she's talking them down like she's been doing this for years." Tyler nodded silently, unable to reconcile the student pilot he thought he knew with the aviation professional, currently saving 2 lives through radio communications. Sarah's expertise was revealing itself to be far deeper than anyone had suspected, built through years of intensive training that Academy students had never experienced. The radio crackled with the King Air pilot's next transmission. Western States, 74 Delta Mike passing through 1,800 feet at 2 minutes into approach. "Everything looks good so far. How much further to the runway?" "King Air 74 Delta Mike, you're doing excellent work," Sarah replied. "Continue descent to 1,000 feet. That's your minimum descent altitude. At 4 minutes and 20 seconds, if you don't have visual contact with the runway, we'll execute a missed approach and try again." Sacramento Approach Control provided position updates that confirmed the aircraft was tracking precisely down the final approach course. The radar controller's voice carried professional admiration as he coordinated with Sarah's guidance. "Western States Emergency Assistance, Sacramento Approach. Your aircraft is performing beautifully on the approach, showing right on course and glide path." Instructor Hayes stood near the emergency radio equipment, his earlier objections to Sarah's involvement now seeming not just wrong, but potentially catastrophic. If the Academy had followed his recommendations and refused to let Sarah assist, the King Air would still be flying blind through deteriorating weather with no viable landing options. His evaluation of her competence had been revealed as fundamentally flawed. "Mitchell," Hayes said quietly, approaching Sarah's position, "I need to apologize. I was completely wrong about your capabilities." Sarah didn't acknowledge the comment, remaining focused entirely on the emergency approach. Personal vindication could wait too. Lives still depended on her ability to guide the aircraft safely through the final phases of the approach. The most critical moments were approaching as the King Air descended toward minimum altitude in weather conditions that would challenge any pilot. Western States, 74 Delta Mike level at 1,000 feet, 4 minutes into approach. Still in solid clouds, no visual reference yet. Patient is alert and vital signs appear stable. Sarah checked her watch and calculated the remaining time and distance to the runway. The approach was progressing perfectly according to published procedures, but success ultimately depended on the pilot's ability to transition from instrument to visual flight at the last possible moment. If visibility didn't improve, they would have to execute a missed approach and attempt the procedure again. King Air 74 Delta Mike, you're right on target. In 30 seconds, you should be over the runway threshold. Start looking for runway lights or approach lighting systems. If you don't see anything for 4 minutes and 20 seconds, begin the missed approach procedure immediately. The tension in the dispatch office was palpable as everyone listened for the pilot's next transmission. The outcome of the emergency would be determined in the next few seconds as the aircraft approached the point where instrument guidance ended and visual flying began. Sarah had done everything possible to position the King Air for a successful landing, but the final phase required the pilot to see the runway through near-zero visibility conditions. Western States, King Air 7-4 Delta Mike ... I've got lights. I can see approach lights directly ahead. Beginning visual approach to the runway. The dispatch office erupted in cheers and applause as the pilot's excited voice confirmed visual contact with Stockton Metropolitan Airport. Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her, but she remained professional and focused on completing the emergency assistance. King Air 74 Delta Mike, excellent work. You're cleared for landing runway 29 left. Emergency vehicles are standing by. Congratulations on outstanding flying under extremely challenging conditions. Western States Emergency Assistance, 74 Delta Mike turning final approach. I cannot thank you enough. You saved our lives today. Landing assured, emergency vehicles in sight. Patient is conscious and stable. The successful conclusion of the emergency marked the end of the most intense 20 minutes in Western States Aviation Academy's history. Sarah had guided a disabled aircraft through an instrument approach that challenged every aspect of her training and experience. The King Air was safely on the ground, the patient was receiving medical attention, and 2 lives had been preserved through aviation skills that exceeded anything the Academy typically produced. Caldwell approached Sarah as she replaced the radio microphone on its clip. His expression mixed professional respect with personal amazement at what he had just witnessed. Mitchell, that was the most impressive display of aviation competence I've seen in 30 years of flying. The gathered students and instructors began offering congratulations and expressing admiration for Sarah's performance. Marcus Chun pushed through the crowd to shake her hand, his earlier dismissive attitude completely transformed. Sarah, that was absolutely incredible. Where did you learn to fly approaches like that? Modesto Municipal, Sarah replied simply. Frank Novak taught me partial panel procedures and emergency techniques. He said real pilots needed to be prepared for situations that didn't exist in textbooks. Jessica Hartwell stepped forward, her expression showing genuine respect for the first time in their acquaintance. I owe you an apology. I completely misjudged your flying abilities. What you just did was pure professionalism. The radio crackled one final time with the King Air pilot's voice. Western States Emergency Assistance, 74 Delta Mike is safely on the ground. Patient is being transferred to emergency medical services and appears to be in stable condition. I'd like to know the name of the person who talked us down. I owe them dinner for the rest of my life. Sarah keyed the microphone for the last time. King Air 74 Delta Mike. This is Sarah Mitchell, student pilot. Just glad we could help. Fly safely. The pilot's response was immediate and emotional. Sarah Mitchell, you are one hell of a pilot. Thank you for bringing us home. As the emergency frequency returned to normal monitoring status, the reality of what had occurred began settling over the academy personnel. A student they had repeatedly rejected for their professional program had just demonstrated aviation expertise that exceeded that of most certified flight instructors. Her competence under pressure, knowledge of complex procedures, and ability to communicate effectively in crisis situations had proven themselves under the ultimate test. Caldwell requested a private meeting with Sarah in his office, away from the crowd of students and instructors who were still processing the day's events. His office was lined with photographs of distinguished academy graduates and awards, recognizing the institution's contributions to aviation education. Sarah had never been invited into this sanctum of academy leadership before. Mitchell, I need to address some serious misunderstandings about your qualifications and capabilities. Caldwell began, settling behind his desk with obvious discomfort. Today's performance has forced me to reevaluate everything we thought we knew about your aviation skills. Sarah waited silently, unsure where the conversation was heading. She had proven her competence beyond any reasonable doubt, but academy politics often operated according to logic that had little to do with actual flying ability. I've reviewed your training records and spoken with several instructors about your previous applications, Caldwell continued. It's clear that we've made some significant errors in our evaluation process. Your aviation knowledge and practical skills obviously exceed our requirements for professional program admission. The admission was more than Sarah had expected, but it came too late to undo years of rejection and frustration. She had developed her expertise despite academy opposition rather than because of their support. The institution that should have nurtured her talents had instead created barriers that nearly prevented her from using those skills to save lives. What happens now? Sarah asked directly. Caldwell leaned forward, his expression showing genuine regret for the academy's previous decisions. I'm recommending immediate admission to our commercial pilot program with advanced standing. Your demonstrated competence qualifies you for accelerated training that could have you certified for airline operations within 6 months. The offer represented everything Sarah had worked toward for years: professional training, advanced certification, and direct entry into commercial aviation careers. But it came with the bitter taste of validation that had required a life-or-death emergency to achieve. She wondered how many other qualified students had been excluded by evaluation processes that seemed designed to favor connections over competence. I'll need some time to consider the offer, Sarah replied carefully. Of course, Caldwell acknowledged. But I hope you'll accept. The Academy needs students like you pilots who understand that flying is about more than perfect weather and textbook procedures. Real aviation requires exactly the kind of skills you demonstrated today. As Sarah left Caldwell's office, she reflected on the strange turns her aviation journey had taken. A morning that began with canceled flights due to weather had evolved into an emergency that showcased capabilities she had developed through independent training. The academy that had questioned her decision-making was now praising exactly those skills that had enabled her to save 2 lives. The other students gathered around her as she returned to the dispatch area, eager to learn more about her training, background, and aviation experience. Marcus Chun seemed particularly interested in understanding how she had developed such advanced instrument skills outside the Academy's formal programs. Would you be willing to share some of your training techniques? Marcus asked. I'd love to learn the partial panel procedures you used today. Sarah looked around at the faces surrounding her students who had ignored or dismissed her for years. Were now seeking her guidance and expertise. The irony was obvious but not entirely satisfying. Recognition earned through emergency circumstances felt different from acceptance, based on genuine respect for her dedication and abilities. "I'd be happy to help," Sarah replied. "Frank Novak at Pacific Flight Services taught me most of what I know. He's always looking for serious students who want to learn real flying skills." The suggestion that Academy students might benefit from training at a modest county airport operation would have been laughable just hours earlier. Now it seemed like wisdom worth considering, especially from someone who had just proven her competence under the most demanding conditions possible. As the day wound toward evening, Sarah reflected on the complexity of validation that came through. Crisis rather than recognition. She had saved 2 lives and earned the respect of people who had previously questioned her abilities. But the path to that moment had required years of persistence in the face of institutional barriers that seemed designed to exclude pilots like her. The King Air emergency would become a legend at Western States Aviation Academy, discussed in classrooms and referenced in training scenarios for years to come. But for Sarah, it represented something more personal, proof that competence and dedication could overcome prejudice and politics, even when the stakes couldn't be higher. Captain Sarah Mitchell walked across the tarmac at San Francisco International, her wings gleaming in the morning sun. 6 months had passed since the emergency that changed everything. The Academy's offer of admission sat declined on her desk. She had chosen a different path. Pacific Advanced Aviation, the school she co-founded with Frank Novak, now trained pilots for major carriers. Students came not for prestige, but for the kind of real-world skills that saved lives when everything went wrong. The waiting list stretched 6 months. Captain Martinez, the King Air pilot, had made good on his promise. His recommendation to Pacific Southwest Airlines opened doors no Academy connection ever could. Her interview was brief. "Can you handle pressure?" The answer was already proven. Marcus Chun became her first student. His trust fund couldn't buy the confidence that came from mastering emergencies. Under Sarah's guidance, he transformed from test taker to pilot. Amanda Pierce followed the same path, joining the airline 3 months later. Hayes had requested one final meeting before Sarah left for the airlines. His apology was complete, admitting his prejudices nearly cost 2 lives. He now sent students to Frank's program, understanding that challenge built character better than comfort. The Academy restructured their entire evaluation system. Caldwell used Sarah's story to train new instructors, emphasizing that competence emerged from unexpected places. Economic background became irrelevant. Flying ability became everything. Flight 1247 to Los Angeles carried 147 passengers who trusted her expertise. Sarah's first officer was an Academy graduate with perfect scores and 0 real experience. She shared Frank's wisdom during preflight: prepare for what hasn't happened yet. The Marine layer reminded her of grandfather's lesson: weather obeyed physics, not privilege. Aviation worked the same way. Aircraft responded to skill, not social status. Real pilots earned their place through preparation and performance. Her rejection had led to Frank's mentorship, which built capabilities the Academy never could. Sometimes the longest road led exactly where you belonged. The students she mentored, the lives she touched, the changes she inspired, none would have existed without those initial denials. Her story became part of airline training folklore, though Sarah insisted on focusing on principles over personality. Aviation needed pilots who prepared thoroughly, flew skillfully, and served humbly. These qualities developed anywhere determination met proper guidance. The quiet strength that sustained her through rejection evolved into leadership that inspired. Confidence. She commanded through demonstrated competence, not institutional credentials. Her authority came from action, not approval. True strength wasn't proving others wrong, it was proving yourself right when it mattered most. Sarah's journey showed that competence conquered prejudice, dedication defeated discrimination, and authentic skill outweighed inherited advantage. The sky belonged to those prepared to earn their place in it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.